And Mississippi's secession claims ought to disabuse us of any notion that slavery was a dying economic system in the early 1860s, sort of destined for the dustbin of history, and that had the Civil War not happened, it would have ended sooner rather than later. There's a lot of great new scholarship on the cotton economy, not just in the American South, but globally, that's shown that slavery was really anything but on the wane or on the way out. And sometimes this idea of a dying economic system is attached to this notion of the lost cause, right? Well, the war was kind of futile because the South had a weaker army, and upholding the institution of slavery was futile because it was sort of, the sort of shifts in global capitalism, we're gonna snuff it out anyway. Okay. In reference to the non-slaveholding states of the North, Texas's secessionists wrote, quote, "In all the non-slaveholding states, in violation of that good faith and comity which should exist between entirely distinct nations, the people have formed themselves into a great sectional party, now strong enough in numbers to control the affairs of each of those states, based upon an unnatural feeling of hostility to these southern states, and their beneficent and patriarchal system of African slavery, proclaiming the debasing doctrine of equality of all men, irrespective of race or color, a doctrine at war with nature, in opposition to the experience of mankind, and in violation of the plainest revelations of divine law," end quote. We ought to correct the Texans here. Few white Northerners, including Abraham Lincoln himself, argued that Africans were equal in any social or political sense. On racism, white Texans had more in common with white New Yorkers or white Illini than they presumed. So if none of this has convinced you that the Confederacy was first and foremost concerned with the continuation of race-based slavery, writing in 1861, Confederate Vice President Alexander Stephens made clear that the cornerstone, as he called it, of the Confederate States of America was, quote, "the great truth that the Negro is not equal to the white man, that slavery subordination to the superior race is his natural and normal condition," end quote. So we can look at the historical record of the 1860s. It's quite clear what the Confederate project was about. And if we look at the 100 years that followed, it's clear that that project of subordinating people of African descent in all manner of life did not die with Lee's surrender on April 9th, 1865. What followed in the aftermath of the Civil War was a period of Union Army occupation of the rebellious states, the enforcement of emancipation of African-American political rights, experiments in economic redistribution. This is the 40 acres and a mule project. Formal education for African Americans where it had previously been illegal. I write about this in my book. I hope you guys are okay with a shameless and so forth, right? So there was this attempt after the war to move in a different direction and secure political, economic rights for freed slaves and their descendants. But as federal troops receded from various states at different points, the federal troops are all gone from the South by 1877. Most of the states sort of are left to the devices of those that lived there in the early 1870s. The South descends into this kind of gruesome set of race-based persecutions and practices. And it's really within this context, kind of post-war context, that this lost cause, this idea and practice and representation really begins to emerge. Okay? So early on in the late 1860s, 1870s, even into the 1880s, the first part of the lost cause ideology is really the key one, that it elevated noble defeat in battle. And many of the earliest monuments to the Confederacy were in fact to individual Confederate soldiers, sometimes specifically named, sometimes sort of unknown soldiers, or sort of broadly conceived. And these were usually erected with private money, often in the confines of cemeteries where some of these soldiers were in fact buried. Once they were organized in 1894, the United Daughters of the Confederacy took on the mantle of fundraisers and kind of guardians, even upkeep of many of these monuments well into the 20th century. In fact, this is one of the things that the UDC does today, a sort of preservation of this Confederate past. As Reconstruction and the occupation of the South drew to a close, Confederate memorialization becomes a bit bolder, more pronounced. It becomes more public. It moves out of the cemetery, off of the battlefield, and onto courthouse grounds, into the kind of public life of towns and cities in the South. Okay? And it's not a coincidence that the height of Confederate monument building coincided with the wholesale gutting of equal rights for Black Americans, the apex of which was the U.S. Supreme Court's 1896 decision in Plessy versus Ferguson, which established separate but equal as the law of the land. I want to pause for a minute, and if we could go to the next slide, kind of think about this in the larger context, right? So the Southern Poverty Law Center does really good kind of tracking and marking of this stuff, and they've put together a couple of nice maps and timelines for us. You can see here on the timeline that sort of spike between, let's say, 1900 and 1920, where you've got this kind of flurry of monument building and naming of buildings or streets or maybe schools in some cases. Actually, most of those, schools and monuments on courthouse grounds. We see a lot of that going on in that 20-year period. This coincides with the elimination of equal rights for blacks in the South by the 1890s and then into the 20th century. And the presence of these monuments in public spaces rather than maybe sort of semi-private spaces like cemeteries is an important component of that, this kind of boldness of Confederate symbolism in this part of the 20th century. Okay. White Northerners had a part in this too. Many of them began to subscribe to a reconciliationist position on the Civil War by this time, by the early 20th century and the end of the 19th century. The historian David Blight, who wrote a book in 2001 called Race and Reunion, he's meticulously documented this kind of reunification or reconciliation of white Southerners and Northerners. And the 50th commemoration of the Battle of Gettysburg, which took place in the battle took place in 1863, the commemoration in 1913. A meeting of Union and Confederate veterans, many of them, aging, they're in their 70s by this time, marked a kind of symbolic end to the hostilities between the North and the South. It's perhaps the most pronounced example of this kind of reconciliation. We've got an image next of the Gettysburg. Let's go one more.